You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zehnder. Today we discuss teaching, writing, and the evangelization of culture. Our welcome and returning guest is Patrick Tomassi. He teaches junior high and high school math and science at Trinity Academy in Portland, Oregon. He even takes students backpacking around the Pacific Northwest. Tomasi's work has appeared in Public Discourse, America, and Plough Quarterly. He's also contributing editor at Veritas Journal and helps organize the annual New York Encounter. He is a member of Communion and Liberation, founded by the late Msgr Luigi Giussani. As always, we begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. First, Patrick, if I may, a quick update. When last we spoke with you, Portland's ongoing protests were at the top of the news. What's going on there now?
Yeah, I have to say that since the inauguration, the last protest I actually went to report on was on the day of the inauguration, and that was a little more than I bargained for. I got tear gassed, and I was also just finishing my long piece in Plough Quarterly about Antifa, so I was more or less done with that. And since then, I have not been to another protest. The media attention has definitely died down quite a bit, and I would say that the protests are no longer affecting life in the same way for Portlanders. There aren't as many things like news reports about attacks on federal buildings or things like that, or traffic stopped. The types of things that get on into people's attention. I would say that the biggest thing that I've noticed recently is the mayor of Portland, who is unbelievably unpopular. He kept his seat. He was the incumbent in the last election in 2020, and was running against someone who described herself at one point saying, "I am Antifa." He barely beat her. So he's incredibly unpopular. I've heard him on the radio the other day talking about the crime situation in Portland, which is really bad. Homicides are up more than 200%. and he was talking about it was a sort of the political spin game around how do I spin the fact that we're trying to hire more cops now, where a year ago he was talking about defunding the police and things like that, or changing funding, and we did make a lot of changes, and the police did lose a lot of funding, or funding was moved to other services, and now the mayor is talking about, well, we actually have to hire more cops, and we need we need to do it in a way that is more that where the police are more aware of the needs of communities of color and things like that, but that they're now trying to ramp up the police presence in the city.
So lots of debate, but debate that tries to put things in the right context, the absolutely correct context. I'll just add as a postscript that here in Los Angeles, we've gone from defund to refund, but at the same time, breaking news, as they say, it turns out that not traffic stops, but bicycle stops, as in people riding their bicycles. Those bicycle stops have been very lopsided. Primarily Latinos are stopped, and very often there's a check for contraband, and it turns out that while there are fewer, I still say Anglos, while there are fewer Anglos stopped, there's more contraband found in their bicycles than in the bicycles of the Latinos. Well, all right, we're all adjusting to the recent readjustments of the adjustments. Mario, could you tell us where we should be going next? That was just a quick update, and we got a lot of new things to talk about.
Well, I think we invited Patrick to talk a little bit about the New York encounter. It would be good if you, Patrick, can explain the beginning or the genesis of that encounter.
Yeah. So I wasn't around at the beginning, but the New York encounter started just out of a desire of a handful of friends to put the charism of communion and liberation to test, basically, in front of everyone. So they thought, let's bring together speakers who are interesting, who have done interesting things, or who've written interesting things, and let's engage with them. They took their sort of marching orders from Pope Benedict, who said, I'm gonna butcher this quote, but something about the intelligence of faith has to become the intelligence of reality. And they took that to mean that if the faith is really relevant to life, then it's relevant to all parts of life, from how we think about the economy and politics, to how we live with our families, to education, science, to art and culture, music and film. So they brought together, I think the first time, just a handful of folks, and they rented an auditorium for it may have been a couple of days, but since then it's grown and grown, and now we rent the Metropolitan Pavilion in Manhattan for 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday of President's Day weekend, and we have events Friday night to Sunday night on 2 floors and 2 auditoriums, and have thousands of people come every year to see those events.
Any follow-up, Mario?
Well, you mentioned in passing about the trying to test, if you will, the charism of Father Giussani. What was that charism? What is that charism all about? Can you explain a little bit about that?
That's sort of a trick question, I think. It's a good question, and it's a question that people who belong to community and liberation often struggle to answer. The charism of community and liberation, I want to answer more from personally from how I experience it. I would say that Father Giussani said that it was about showing the relevance of faith for daily life. That Christianity is not simply a set of rules or ethical teachings or a system of thought, but that it's relevant to life. That he would talk about like the human advantage of Christianity. That there is something that makes life better here and now about Christianity, and that ultimately that is an encounter with the person of Christ that is lived, not something that happens as an ethereal thing, but in a human relationship. So I mean, the movement of community liberation started in Italy in the 1950s when he perceived in his students the fact that they knew all of the catechism answers to the answers to the sort of catechism questions. They knew all of the sort of what they were supposed to learn in religious education classes, but the faith didn't mean anything to them. So he saw in the 50s what many Catholics blame on Vatican II. That he saw that these kids are going to walk away. None of them, the faith doesn't mean anything to them. They're being raised in a way that is, the faith is formalistic, moralistic, and dry. And so he quit his job teaching the seminaries, in a seminary in Milan, and went to teach in the public high school. They have religion in the public high schools in Milan or in Italy. And so he went to teach religion at Berchet High School in Milan. And the movement grew out of that. Out of that first class of students that he had, who were provoked by this priest who looked at all of life in a more interesting way, in a way that he pushed them to ask questions about the meaning of life that they weren't being asked, or if they were being asked them, actually I think they were being asked them, but not within the context of Christianity. It was the Marxists who were asking about the meaning of life and had a particular proposal. And so he provoked them to ask those questions. And because he was convinced from his own life, from his own experience, that the meaning of life is a person, and that the infinite became finite, became history in the incarnation, and that like he would frequently say, he died to rise again, and he's risen to stay. So I think he was quoting maybe Paul Claudel. So that Christ doesn't come, die, leave. He comes, dies, and remains in his body in the church. So I said I was gonna explain what the charism of CL is in a personal way, and then I just gave the origin story, the historical explanation. I bumped into people in CL as a high schooler, and found that this was this place. We had maybe 6 of us from my high school that would meet weekly with an adult from Milan who had started a group in Portland. And I was an angsty teenager, more angsty than most of the kids I meet as a teacher. I had a lot of questions. I was aware of an uncomfortable need to be happy, and pretty insistent on it, I guess. You know, I wasn't like willing to just back down from that. And it was at GS, which is the high school CL sort of contingent. It stands for Juventus Studentesca, student youth. Anyway, it was with those kids that I found that like these questions that I had, and this desire that I had to for life to be meaningful, to get to the bottom of things, for the little things, the schoolwork I had, and the relationships with my classmates to be greater. So I had no idea what they were talking about. We were reading a book that I have reread maybe twice since then and still don't really understand, by Father Giussani. But I didn't understand a word of it when I was in high school. But I was struck by these people, and I wanted to stick with them, and so I kept hanging out with them. And then in college, sort of re-encountered a number of them, and I found myself sort of continually drawn back to this place, and I didn't quite have words for why I wanted to be there, other than to say like my life is better when I'm with these people. The experience of the church is more full, and that, I guess, for me was why I stuck with them. I guess for the last 16 years.
That gives us a very personal perspective. Now, Christopher might want to follow up on that, or as you mentioned before we started, you have to leave on the hour to go to work. So I don't know, maybe Christopher, who writes books for places like Trinity Academy, maybe Christopher will want to talk about that. What do you say, Christopher?
I don't know. I work. All I do is write books for places like Trinity Academy. I'm more interested in the communion of liberation. But
all right, go for it.
Yeah, I have some familiarity with it. I've been to 2 meetings, and I've had friends of it, communion of liberation. I have never found it really to be something that I would want to pursue. But what I've noticed in what you were talking about, you talk about it like almost like I guess the term you see others use is like personal encounter, right? A personal encounter with Christ. There's a lot about the personal encounter, but earlier on you talked about that the faith has to be something which influences all of human life, and that would have to do with not only the individual life of persons, but it would have to also deal with the life as we live communally in the state and culture and that sort of thing. What's the nexus between those two things, between the personal encounter? How do you go from the personal encounter to which seems to be so central to this vision of the faith influencing all of life?
That is a great question that I need to think about a little bit. I'm going to stall here. How do you go from faith being fundamentally an encounter with a person to faith being something that has to do with all of life? Well, is it a cop-out to say if that person has to do with all of life? You know, if Christ doesn't come to give us some sort of a spiritual redemption, but to redeem all of life that he cares about. I mean, well, you can, when you read the Gospels, it's pretty clear that one of the things Jesus cares the most about is economics. Half of his parables are economic in some way. He cares deeply about, the poor. We know that, but he cares about how we live with one another. Man, it was such a good question though, and that's not really my answer.
Well, Christopher's writing a book on that for Catholic high schools.
That's right. No,
go ahead.
I'm not sure if this would help, but something that just occurs to me. Is it that our primary encounter with Christ is not personal, but it's actually corporate, and it only becomes personal through the corporate. Because one of the things I when I was listening to you, I was thinking, I heard you mention the term church once on entire explanation, but church didn't seem so central. What seemed more central was the personal.
Oh, I see. I think that's more probably of an inconsistency maybe on my part than anything. I think that for Father Giussani, the church was definitely like extremely central. We're reading something right now in the CL community here, in which he said explicitly, like, the movement of community liberation is not something outside the church, and it's not like a chunk of the church. This is a way to live the entirety of the church. This is a way to for Catholics to live their relationship with the body of Christ. So, I mean, as an example of that, he modeled this very active obedience to his bishop and the Pope that really wasn't actually all that aware of until I started reading his biography. That he started this community in Milan, and the bishop was Giovanni Montini, Pope Paul VI later, who was very confused by it and actually never really got his head around quite what CL was. Giussani would say the whole time, if Archbishop Montini or Cardinal Montini says stop, we stop, we're done. Because for him, it was clear that the bishop is the apostle, and the apostles are what hold the church together. So I would say that the experience of the church is definitely a huge part of community liberation. I mean, what do we do together other than reading Father Giussani and spending time? We're going to mass. We're going on a pilgrimage. These different things that are very much sort of participation in the life of the church. I want to try to answer your question about the corporate and individual. Thinking about, gosh, man, it's a good question. It's a really hard question. Sorry, Mario. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to meddle in this, but it seems to me that when we raise a question of that caliber, if you will, that is coming from a different, and I'm going to use a word, experience. Here, we recognize who we are by being struck by a community. In other words, the distinction between the personal and the communal is, yes, maybe that is a very good academic distinction, but in the experience of community liberation, as I experience, is perhaps not quite meaningful, because I encounter, yes, Christ in the face of another, but that another is such because he belonged to a community. In other words, if I experience the recognition of my own dignity as a child of God, is because I belong to a community. You can make a scholastic distinction and say, well, then the primacy is the community. I would say, well, yes, because ultimately is the church. And there is one interesting thing, way of explaining, is communion and liberation. It's a community. And that community is the church. And the church is a movement. It moves. It's not something theoretical, rather than it's alive. And alive is what moves you. So when you are struck because you are accustomed to speculate about things about the church, you are a philosopher, a theologian, or whoever learned about principles. Those principles seems to me, at least is my experience, don't have a way to believe, rather than being speculative. In other words, how we implement. That is not what you experience when you really encounter Christ in that community. It's different. Now, you may say, well, how you explain conceptually. That's a different question. Sometimes it's very difficult. So that, I think, was my own experience. In other words, there is some moment where your life in some way stopped and you just began realizing that there is something factual, the presence of Christ, which is within a community, and that transforms your own person. So I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying, but one final thing I think it can help us. One of the things that I began realizing this method is what Father Giussani always repeated, that there is no worse answer to the question that hasn't been raised. To me was critical because my whole life before I met the movement, I knew and very well many answers to the fundamental question of life. Of course, I was supposedly teaching philosophy. But I haven't really raised those questions, were given to me. And I had to say, well, amen, because whether it's the Catechism or Aquinas, and then I said, amen. And probably those answers were correct. But they were not the answer to question that I myself in first person has been searching for. And so I need to memorize them instead of, yes, searching for the answer, but the answer was a response to my own search. So it should be incarnate. Now, all of this is a product not of my own talent or anyone's talent. I think it's grace. I see in that way, and I don't know if it helped, but I don't know if you have anything to say about that, Patrick.
I think we found the person that you guys should be interviewing about communal liberation. It's not me.
We've interviewed him before. We want to look at the next generation.
Oh, well, I might not be a good sign of the next generation. But no, I think what Mario is saying is spot on. I think that, in fact, I remember when that phrase, the most unreasonable thing, or something like the most unreasonable thing is the answer to a question that's not being asked, which is a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr, the American Protestant theologian, who Giussani wrote his dissertation on. I remember when that was said, when I first read or heard that. Well, I heard it in a talk, and I remember how much it provoked me, because it was like, that's it. That's what was happening to me when I was in 9th grade or 10th grade. When I
Patrick, could you repeat that phrase one more time?
The most unreasonable thing is the answer to a question that's not being asked. Something along those lines. And that, to me, yeah, it's not that the answer isn't true, right? I mean, I grew up in a very both politically conservative, but also sort of liturgically conservative community, church community, all of that, right? Where we had religious ed every Wednesday, CCD, my whole childhood, right? So by the time I was in 9th grade or 10th grade, right, I knew all of the answers. In fact, I had participated for a number of years, I think maybe 5 years, in sort of a like Catholic trivia contest thing, sort of Jeopardy style. That's an embarrassing fact about me. And so, I mean, I had literally memorized, like I could spell Karol Wojtyła, and and I knew the size, the measurements of the Ark of the Covenant in cubits and spans. I don't know anymore. And I knew all of the facts, right? I knew all the things. But it was when I encountered those classmates of mine in 10th grade, I guess, that it was like, oh, wait a second, this is responding to my questions. My question isn't necessarily about this thing about the Eucharist. Not that the Eucharist isn't real. Not that any of that. It's just that those questions hadn't arisen in me, and the question that was arising in me was like, what is the point of going to high school? What is the point of any of this stuff? And that was like, what is the like? I have these friendships, and I want something deeper. I want to be loved in a way that doesn't die. Like it was those sorts of questions and desires that were coming up, and yeah, so that was where I started to, like, why I found myself drawn, like I said earlier, is because it responded to my actual lived experience and my questions.
Let me try a little compare and contrast. More on the compare side than the contrast side. St. John Henry Newman is famous for his fundamental distinction between notional assent and real assent. And it seems to me that you're very much in the neighborhood of that distinction. Now, maybe the next thing is going to be more on the contrast side. I don't know. We've on this program, in various ways and with various guests, spoken about the Benedict option. Could you contrast communion and liberation or the Benedict option, or is it not much there to contrast? What's the story?
I would say, firstly, the notional and real consent or assent thing is like, I totally agree. That is sort of, that's a very helpful way for me to think about this. That you can notionally assent to all sorts of things, but it remains sort of in your head. I would say I'm not extremely familiar with the Benedict option. I have read a number of Rod Dreher's articles. I didn't actually read the book, so I don't want to sort of oversell my understanding of it. I have been. I think that where I see comparison, where I see things that are similar, is in a desire for real, substantial community, where the faith is a lived experience. So where, a lot of the communities that Rod Dreher is interested in are ones where faith is lived in a very intentional way, in a very serious way, as a to use a term that Father Giussani would use, as like a unifying hypothesis for reality. That like this isn't just sort of something we do on Sunday. This is the thing that explains life. So I think he's drawn to communities like that, and in fact, Rod Dreher is interested for sure. He's like he looks at community liberation and says, I think there's something there. and he's friends with a number of people in community liberation. I would say that most people, myself included, that I've talked, I don't talk to myself, well I do, but most people in community liberation that I talk with about
Nothing wrong with that.
that I talk to about the Benedict option have a similar judgment, which is that it seems to be more interested in protecting the flock than in the world. So I know that he's interested in this idea that Benedict created the monasteries, and the monasteries eventually saved Europe. So it's not that he's not interested in Christianity being lived in public. But I would say that like the New York Encounter and the Benedict option as sort of, I would see them as sort of not opposite, but like two fairly different ways of looking at things. That for us in community liberation, we want to put the faith to the test in front of everyone in the world and engage with everything. And we invite speakers, for example, to the New York Encounter who come from all backgrounds. Some of them from like militant atheist backgrounds, and so I think that what I would say that I think there's less fear with the people that I talk with anyway, in community liberation, less fear of the world than I encounter with people that are interested, that are like really, really interested in the Benedict option, or that I seem to encounter when I read Rod Dreher's writing.
Okay, that helps us. It helps a lot. Christopher, what should we move to now?
Sorry. I thought Mario looked like you had a question or a comment.
May I? I don't know if it can help that or can confuse, but you mentioned Newman. A few years ago, I made a presentation about Newman. And indeed, what Newman proposes is that we are made of the same condition. We have questions. We have a heart. And that heart is the one who subjectively, I'm not talking about subjectivism, take ownership of our own questions. And that is more experiential than merely conceptual knowledge. In that sense, Kierkegaard is the same. Kierkegaard talked about subjectivist truth. It's actually subjectivism in itself. And when I ran into these philosophers, I said that my experience is the same. And it's what Father Giussani is proposing. There is something there in the human condition that everyone shares, even those who are completely the opposite in the ideological spectrum. So the dialogue in that sense is a human dialogue in that particular sense. So Patrick talked about fear. It's not fear rather than love for truth and love for freedom. If we are really free, then we can engage in a dialogue regardless the ideological perspective of anyone. And so in that sense, I believe I cannot make a judgment about here. It's not just isolate yourself in a community so that community become uncontaminated of secular thought rather than open to the world. In that sense, I think community liberation is a little bit different from, I guess, Benedictine option, because the claim is, and it's a claim, you need to verify that claim, is that Christ is present, but it's not present intellectually or culturally. He's present in its totality today. There is a contemporaneousness of Christ today. In that sense, the method is a little bit, I think, different. We don't accumulate tradition for the sake of tradition, even Catholic tradition, rather than is the fact of Christ. So maybe that in the future, there is a new culture that is impregnated by this fact of Christ. So I think that is maybe that can help to approach communal liberation, I think.
Yeah, I think you said the word heart there, which I think is the thing that I've left out in what I've said. That's sort of the key. Father Giussani would talk about the idea from Scripture of the human heart being this need, the need for truth, goodness, beauty, right? The transcendentals, but the human heart is the same in everyone. And if that's true, right, then like me and my the atheist or neo-pagan or Buddhist or whoever it is that I'm having a conversation with have the same need. And the Christian claim is that Christ comes to correspond to the human heart, to be as the answer to this need that we all experience. So yeah, and that I think I totally agree with what you're saying, Mario. That in that case, there's this sort of radical kind of openness rather than a closing in to protect ourselves from the outside influence. To say like you and I, who are so different, have the same need, and the same person comes to answer that. I watched recently a discussion of the life of Father Giussani, and one person that was interviewed in it was a Buddhist monk, the abbot of a Buddhist monastery, who was very close friends with Father Giussani. And in the conclusion of that little back and forth about his relationship with Father Giussani, the moderator said that when Giussani met this person, that he was really, really amazed and drawn to him for this reason of the heart. And he said if they had met this monk, I think had come to Italy, and so he leaves and he's waving, and Father Giussani is standing there waving as he drives away, and then he leans over to the person next to him and he says, if that man was alive 2,000 years ago in Palestine, he would have been one of the apostles. So that his heart was so alive that like the apostles. So he recognized in him the same heart. Anyway, so that to me, that I think that's what makes communal liberation so able to be radically open.
All right. Thank you very much. Now Christopher's got to have his say here.
Just two things apropos our discussion so far. As a member of the Dominican order, I have to point out.
Going to Plough.
No, that in speaking about the heart, I think there's two ways one can go wrong. One can ignore the heart and only pay attention to the head. One can ignore the head and pay attention to the heart. I just want to make a plea that I don't think that those things, I don't think they're opposed. I don't think these two faculties are opposed, but that they should be complemented. So we have to have the rigor of the mind as well as the affectivity of the heart. Secondly, we were talking a bit before about questions that are being asked. It seems to me perhaps one of the what should be central, one of the things that would be central to going out into the world, as we say, preaching the gospel, is not simply to answer the questions that are being asked, but to introduce the questions that ought to be asked. So I think there's a number. I know it from if we're going to talk about experience, my own experience before I became Catholic. I was a teenager. I was 19 when I became Catholic. I was introduced to questions that I had never thought to ask, and that experience actually opened my mind to whole new realities. So I think it's not simply a matter of what is important to the people, what do the people today think is important to them, but also showing them by questioning what ought to be important to them. So if you want to comment that also, but if you don't, we could move on to your work at Trinity Academy.
I just have a quick comment, which is I think that where I see something similar in my experience working with students is this you see ones who are particularly alive. At least I see ones who are particularly alive, and the question to me is like not necessarily to tell them the questions, but to sort of help these natural questions to arise. I lead a GS group at the school, which is the high school CL group. That I just started it. I just started it this year. It's my 8th year at the school, and I just started it. And the first week there was this young woman who said, I asked her why she had come, and she said, "Well, like the questions you're asking me are my questions." And I go to my life and I ask these questions, and I realize that there's so much more that I need to see that I wasn't realizing. So the questions have to sort of arise in us, I think.
Now for Trinity.
Yeah, what do you want to know?
Well, you've got to be there. You got to, I don't know what. You got to work there. What's your work like?
Oh, it's great. I'm actually there already. I'm in a... I came in early this morning. You can see my our Salvador Dali here. We have a lot of beautiful artwork in the school. So Trinity is a very small ecumenical school. We have Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox faculty, and we take as our starting place the Nicene Creed, and then students from a variety of backgrounds. The majority are Protestant, I think, at this point. It's about maybe 55% Protestant. The rest mostly Catholic. Some from no faith tradition or explicitly atheist traditions, or from Islam. I've been here for 8 years, and I teach physics mostly, and then junior high science, and in the past I've taught math as well. And I'll be teaching about world issues for the first time next spring. So I'll be doing a non-STEM class for the first time. But I would say that the thing that makes this way of doing it's a classical school, but let's see here. I should backtrack. We think of ourselves as classical in the sense of how we approach literature. So we read the classics, and we do Socratic style seminar discussions in a lot of the classes. But in terms of science, we don't really approach it the way that classical schools tend to approach science. Instead, there's this. We teach it maybe more like you would see in a standard school, but with a much stronger emphasis on wonder. And I think for me, that's why I was originally drawn to this school. Was that I was in Spain, actually. I was at the Sagrada Familia, which is my favorite building in the world, and I had just finished engineering school and was standing there looking at this incredible, still uncompleted cathedral, and which I had seen photos of my whole life. And I stood there and I said, I have never cared as much about engineering in 5 years of engineering school as I do right now. This is because this building is so beautiful and so innovative. and I was just like full of this of wonder about science and mathematics and engineering, and I ended up spending multiple days there just to go more into that. And right around that time, I got an email from my now boss asking if I was interested in teaching, and I thought, if teaching can be conveying this experience of wonder at the world, then yeah, I want to try that. And it turns out that this is a school in which that is how we approach math and science. So it's great.
Let me ask a question that has to be asked. Are you solvent?
Am I what?
Is Trinity Academy solvent?
Yes.
Can you keep going?
Oh yeah, we are. Portland's an interesting place, right? It's the most unchurched. Oregon is the most unchurched state in the union, supposedly. We're very. There's a lot of the polarization is extreme. It's really extreme here. So places like Trinity, people find us because they're looking for a really good Christian education. I can't tell you how many priests who've told me, I wish my Catholic school were like your non-Catholic school. Because you get a better Catholic education at this ecumenical school. So we have had waiting lists for many of our classes for the last several years because we're in a very small building and we need to expand.
Very good. Mario, you want to take us forward again?
Well, I don't know if forward or backward, but in 1978, John Paul II published his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis. In that encyclical, there is a paragraph which more or less said, well, Christ revealed man his own identity. That encyclical, I think I'm an old-fashioned guy, very old, so that encyclical we read because Father Giussani wanted us to read and memorize that. In that claim, I think, show what Patrick is saying here. The question is not a structure. This question is not the institution. The question is a heart which is full of desire for beauty, for goodness. What is the ultimate answer to that? Is Christ. Christ is the one who revealed and say, yes, you were looking for this truth. Now, of course, what then is the method? Well, we need to raise questions. We need to provoke people to ask questions. So it's not a question of going back to the old Christendom. It's not the question of rebuilding or restoring what once was. If that is possible, well, it comes just by pure grace. But ultimately, it's just this encounter with reality as it is. And I think John Paul II said very, very well, if you can think, one can read between the lines. Even he make a comment in his book that he wrote, commenting the 16th document of Vatican II, when he says, I'm just paraphrasing him, it's more important than to know what is being taught, how we taught. It's a question of method. And so people can memorize everything and then they don't know how to leave those things. And I think that's the line, Jim, that you are very familiar with Dorothy Day, when she said, well, there are many people who are full of sacramental life, but they just pass by when they see people being exploited. And so it's a way of how then we live Christ today. And I think that's the beauty of it. I don't know if I can help it, but I resonate what you are saying about the school. It's not a question of structures. It's something else. It's an encounter with Christ. Is just a fact that destroys every institution, if you will.
I'd like to stir the pot a little bit. Over the years, I've noticed that Mario likes to lead us down the existentialist path, and Christopher likes to have a more of a intellectual vision. And naturally, I found just the right way to go. It's taken years.
This is not going to be a joke, is it?
Humility.
But that said, here are a few thoughts. We know for sure, and we have it on Jesus's own account, that there are ways to love God, and that one of the ways to love God is with our whole mind. Our whole mind. And one way to think about loving the Lord with our whole mind is to dwell a little bit on the overuse, easy use, facile use of appeals to experience and appeals to the heart. Animals have experiences, all kinds of experiences. And if you don't believe me, talk to the local shelters and they'll tell you about the bad experiences that these abandoned animals have had, and they're truly bad. And animals have hearts as well. So when we talk about human experience and we talk about the human heart, we're surely not losing sight of our rational souls. And I think it's very important, and I want to give Christopher credit for this, that we have an integrated view of the human person. And there's lots of ways that this integrated view can be forgotten. From time to time, when Pope Francis speaks, he warns us against being self-referential. Now, there's another term. On the one hand, we're supposed to know ourselves, know thyself. On the other hand, we're not supposed to be self-referential. I can imagine people who are associated with the Holy Father listening to a program like ours and saying, why are they talking to themselves? Why aren't they out doing something for Africa? And of course, on this show, we do things for Africa and Pakistan and the like. There are many faces of the being that is the most real of real, the faces of God himself. And there are many charisms. And Patrick began by pointing to the distinctive and welcome charism of Comunio e Liberazione. On the other hand, I think that people in the Benedict option might say that, well, once upon a time, Father Giussani could say they know everything, but they know nothing because they don't live what they know. Well, here now in our culture, there's no broad knowledge of the fundamental teachings of the faith. We're dealing with a complete, extraordinary ignorance. And at the same time, and I think it builds on this ignorance, we're oftentimes dealing with a direct hostility to the faith. And I want to give a particular instance. The Jesuit, as in faux Jesuit, the Jesuit as in the Jesuit tradition, Loyola Marymount University, just gave space to a student organization called Women in Politics. And Women in Politics is excited by, gosh, everybody's excited these days, excited by its fundraiser for Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood. And if there's anything that's in opposition to the culture of life, it's Planned Parenthood. And the university defended its decision to allow for this. And the people and women in politics themselves are excited. They're having an experience, a transgressive experience of affirming their youth and spontaneity. And not to put too fine a point on it, they're absolutely full of bullshit, and they ought to be called on it. Now, that's a tricky thing to do, and that's my current project. So comments are welcome.
I don't know where to start because you just launched a variety of views. Let me say just a couple of things. The claim, and it's a claim, you need to verify. And if I do verify, doesn't mean that you don't. I cannot judge about your own experience. Close to this, if you want to read a little bit about phenomenological method, will help. But the claim that we say, and Father Giussani said, the heart doesn't exclude the mind. There is an anthropology which is very integral. And by the way, that's Maritain view of integral humanism. So the fact that I use the word heart doesn't mean sentiment, doesn't mean just feelings. There is an integral view of reality, and you are attracted to that, the attraction of reality. And so who is behind that? The sign of reality is Christ. And so we are not saying that we are just emotivist. That's not the way that this method is claiming. Now, the fact that one can, or I can claim that and I verify, I don't exclude that somebody else may have their own charism. The church, by the way, is a garden with a lot of flowers. There are a lot of charism there, and we don't deny that. Now, I may say, well, that's self-referential, that I don't want to get into that, but I don't think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and perhaps a lot of misunderstanding come from the use of this word experience. Why? There is a long history there I don't want to get into, but come from modernism and all the claims that were coming in the 40s and the 50s, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding there, and perhaps can help. It helped me a lot to read. It's an intellectual endeavor. One philosopher who is, I think, unsuspected of being a modernist, and yet he's a personalist. His name was Dietrich von Hildebrand. He wrote a book, The Heart. And I think that book is very telling of what, in some ways, in many ways, we are talking about here. And what I'm saying is that Dietrich von Hildebrand is a phenomenologist. He's not an orthodox, or at least he's not a Thomistic observance, if you will, but he was not against that either. And he was, if you will, a very faithful attendant of the Latin Mass, even though there is a piece about the Latin Mass in the 1960s of Dietrich von Hildebrand when he defended what? In the Latin Mass. It's not the old rite per se, it's not the old church per se, it's the beauty. It's the beauty that attracts him. So I do believe that that's, I think, the way, at least I understand. Another thing is that what I experience is not just a refutation of what other people may be doing. Even though these things are completely against the natural law. The question is about what makes me happy. Is happiness. What made me joyful? And if you do that as a teacher, maybe your students see you in the eye and say, I want that also. So there is a mimesis, if you will, going back to the Greek tradition. There is an imitation because there is an envy. in someone when see someone joyful in the midst of calamities. And that may be a way of evangelizing rather than using syllogism. That's the only, I'm not excluding the other. What I'm saying is the other is not for me. That's the only point. It's a humble point, I think. This is how I would.
I think our guest has to go, so we probably should.
I do. There's a lot more to say on this. I like a lot of the question, and I think Mario is getting at one of the most important distinctions that has to be made when we say heart. We're not talking about sentiment. We're not talking exclusively about sentiment. Like emotions are part of the heart, but they are not the heart. The heart is this nexus of reason and emotion.
Yeah.
But yes, sorry, I do have to run to class here.
We should close, as we always do, with the gospel for the day. This is from Luke. As Jesus continued his journey to Jerusalem, he traveled through Samaria and Galilee. As he was entering a village, 10 lepers met him. They stood at a distance from him and raised their voice, saying, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, he said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." As they were going, they were cleansed. And one of them, realizing he had been healed, returned, glorifying God in a loud voice, and he fell at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. Jesus said in reply, 10 were cleansed, were they not? Where are the other 9? Has none but this foreigner returned to give thanks to God? Then he said to him, "Stand up and go. Your faith has saved you." Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us.
Thank you, Patrick.
All right, thanks, guys. Great to talk to you. Take care.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.